Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Ask Melly segment. So every week I jump in and answer your questions about your emotions on my journey to normalize the emotional cycles all women experience. Because let's face it, sometimes our emotions can be a little tricky. So this week I want to look at depression and specifically the emotional crux you need to know that's at the heart of it. Now, before we jump into this, I need to make something very, very clear. When I say depression, I am talking about mild generalized depression. There are many forms of depression which do require medication and professional help. The depression that I'm talking about is the one that a lot of people experience. It's a chemical imbalance in the brain, but it's not one that requires meditation to fix. It's one that requires us to deal with the internal stuff that is causing this chemical imbalance in the first place. So with that in mind, I needed to be very, very clear about that. One of the things that really fires me up about this is that there are so many people dealing with depression every single day. The stats in Australia at the moment is 1 in 6 Australians are experiencing depression right now. That's 3.2 million people. 3.2 million people suffering from some form of depression right now. And I know this cycle very well. It's something I've dealt with a majority of my life too. I know so many people in my family who have had depression. I know friends who have had depression. It is something that touches all of us in some way, shape, or form because of how common it is. And unfortunately, the only way that's really sold to us as a way to fix it is antidepressants. And yes, I agree, some people need that. I will not say anything bad against those drugs because, yes, they are warranted in some circumstances. However, I feel the crux of the issue is not the chemical imbalance in the brain, but the emotions that we're not dealing with that has caused this chemical imbalance in the brain. Because we know that the body and mind is connected. Science has now proven that if we are feeling a certain way, it has a very physical implication on our body. It's called metaphysics, and it's absolutely fascinating to research. So the thing that's at the heart of depression is that complete loss of pleasure or desire. It's that complete loss of feeling for wanting to get up, to do something, to feel life. It's the shutting down of our external processing. So if it's a shutting down of external processing, then what is that helping us to do? The only thing left is internal processing. And that is where our emotions lie. So here's what I feel is at the base of it. And from my own experiences and those I've worked with, it is fear and shame at the heart of our generalized depression. And if you think about it, external factors are being shut down. So you can't process what's going on out there. It's almost like your body is saying, no, I don't have capacity to take on this. You need to focus on what's in here. And what's in here is a buildup of fear, shame, and guilt that has not been processed. And at the base of it all is this need to be seen and heard, this need to be loved and loved in return. It's this beautiful emotion that when acknowledged, depression can become a really powerful tool for creativity. But you have to address it first. You have to see the fear, acknowledge it. What are you fearful of? And it could be layers. It could be the first fear could be I'll never come out of this depression. And I have to admit, when I start slipping into it, because I do go through cycles, it does come up for me every now and again. When I do start slipping into it, that fear of will I ever come out of this is the first thing to pop up. So I have to acknowledge that. You have to face it and say, yes, I will come out of it because look at the evidence of the past. I have always come out of it in the past. I have always triumphed over depression, so it will not beat me this time. Once you've been able to acknowledge it, then you can see the next layer. What triggered it in the first place? What was the fear? I know when I first started experiencing depression, it was shortly after we had lost some very close relatives in my family. And at the time, I didn't know how to process my grief properly. I was working full time. I was studying after hours. Plus, I would just lost some really, really powerful family members within our unit. And it was like, well, I can't process this. I've got too much on. I didn't give myself the space. So rather than internally processing the grief that had happened, I shut that down. And what happened was depression. Now, unfortunately, I didn't have somebody to help me through it and say, no, you don't need medication. The problem is this. You need to face your grief. Stop being afraid of the grief. Let yourself ride it. I went down the path of antidepressants. And that was because lack of awareness. Went to the doctors, said, hey, this is what's going on. Can you help me? And the first thing they did was, here's a pill. And unfortunately, that did not work for me at all. It ended up making me extremely tired, almost had a car accident because of it. And I got to the point where intuitively I knew I could not be taking these tablets anymore. And it still took me a very long time before I finally learned how to process grief properly. But the core of that was that I didn't know how to be loved. I didn't know how to allow myself to be loved. And it's interesting now that I can look back and see it, that once I acknowledged the fear, I went, yes, this is grief I'm running from. I'm afraid to face my grief. I could then allow the grief to flow. And from there, I could see the love around me, those who were willing to support me and those I could support in return. And it became this beautiful flow-on effect, one from the other. And that's how I believe we can resolve it as well. For anybody with depression, with generalized depression, that you have to face the fear in the first place. It starts with our first stage of self, our princess. What is she afraid of? What is that young girl inside of us afraid of? Usually it comes down to being seen and heard. When it came to the grief, I was afraid to be seen and heard in my grief. Which was wrapped up in all this other stuff as well, wrapped up in grief isn't pretty, grief is loud, you can't be seen to be like that, all those sorts of juicy stuff that has long since been unraveled. But we need to see the fear first. We need to face our inner princess, that teenage girl, and go, what are you afraid of? And name that fear. I think that's the most powerful point. You don't have to go back to the moment, but you need to name the fear. And it's almost like naming it takes away its power over you. Like getting stuck in those cycles of depression, and you can feel yourself slipping into it and addressing the fear immediately and going, I know this is a fear of getting stuck in this space. It immediately loses its power over you. And after you face that first stage of self, your princess, it is natural to then step into your second stage of self, which is your mother. It's that inner nurturer. So then you can look at your own inner princess and mother yourself and go, it's okay to be afraid. It's okay that this has happened. Now it's time to love ourselves and forgive ourselves and find compassion and empathy for ourselves for being in this space. And when you can step through those two stages, that's when pleasure and desire start coming back. Because remember, in the beginning, I said depression is that loss of pleasure and desire. It's that shutting down of the external world. It's almost interesting. It's just coming through. It's almost like self-punishment to some extent, because you are closing yourself off to the goodness of the world. So when you've done the princess's journey, you've done the mother's journey, and you've stepped into that third stage of self, which is your wild woman, that's when your pleasure and desire comes back. That's when the feeling comes back. That's when you start getting a little bit angry about the whole situation, whatever that fear was in the first place, whatever happened to put you in that fear state. That part of yourself gets angry. There's no blame. There's nothing like that. It's just this beautiful anger that then drives you forward. It lights your passion to move forward and get going again. So that's what I've learned about depression, and that the crux of it is fear, shame, and guilt. And I find whenever it cycles back around for myself, it is those things. I do have to look at them again and go, okay, where's the fear? Where's the shame and guilt? Name it, love it, move on. And I find I can cycle. My cycles used to last, to be honest, my cycles used to last 3 to 4 months stuck in depression. And I could mask it very well, but it was still there. And now I find a bad depressive cycle for myself lasts no more than a week. And usually by the end of the week, it's kind of like, oh, I just like the rest, so I'm just going to stay here a little bit longer. So it is possible to get through it. It is possible to shorten those cycles quite considerably, but you have to do the work. You have to face your fears, and you have to love yourself. So I'm going to leave it at that for now, because that's what they're all the notes that I had that I wanted to discuss today. So if you need any help understanding and moving through your own emotional cycles, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. Send me a private message, leave a comment below here. And every week I will drop back with another tricky emotional question for us to look at in our journey together of normalizing the emotional cycles that all women experience. And why? Because once we've normalized those cycles, we will realize that we are magic, and then we can make the next chapter of our lives magical. Love and kindness, everyone.